All right, friends, welcome to our webinar tonight with Dr. Wesley Hill, who I'll introduce in 1 second. But before I introduce him, I'll introduce myself. Although if you're here, you probably know who both of us are. That's why you're here. But my name is Preston Sprinkle, and I'm the president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. And I am really excited about tonight's conversation. I thought about this a while back, Wes, and I just recently reached out to you to see if you do this. But um, Christian, Gay, and Celibacy, an evening with Wesley Hill. Tonight we don't have a lot of time, just an hour, and I want to keep the pace going. So what we're gonna do is me and Wes are gonna have a dialogue for about 30-35 minutes, and then we're gonna go to Q&A. And the Q&A platform. So this is audience Q&A, so you guys can text in your questions. You should have gotten the information. But let's see. Yeah, it should be in your emails. It's through slido.com. And now I'm trying to see the sorry about this. I should have had the info in front of me. Let me see if I can get out of here. Oh yeah. Okay. So slido.com, SLIDO /Webhill, WEBHIL. I guess I can, yeah, we'll just, oh wait, here, I can just show it there. So if you go over here, WEBHIL. So again, one more time, slido.com /WEBHILL, Hill. So, okay. And then, let's see, Slido, yeah, we can just jump in. So my guest tonight is Dr. Wesley Hill. Wes has 2 master's degrees, one from Durham University, one from Bethlehem College and Seminary. He also has a PhD in New Testament from Durham University, and he is currently assistant professor of biblical studies at Trinity School for Ministry. I know, Wes, you've written 2 amazing, well, you've written more than 2 books, but these are the 2 that I'm most familiar with, and many of our audience is probably here tonight because I would say largely probably because they came across this book, Washed and Waiting, Reflections on Christian Faithfulness and Homosexuality, kind of your personal memoir, but also some theological reflection. I mean, this is the first book I read in this conversation. I remember saying, I want to get into this topic, and someone said, you got to read this book. I read this book, Wes, and which it blew me away. I mean, just paradigm shifting. More recently, you wrote Spiritual Friendship, Finding Love in the Church as a Celibate Gay Christian. Whether you're gay, straight, bi, if you're human, you need to read both these books. This one on friendship is just, it's incredible. And I told you offline, but I've learned so much about friendship from hanging out with a lot of Christians who are gay or same-sex attracted over the last several years. And so anyway, thank you for being on this webinar. Thank you for your amazing work in this conversation and many other topics as well.
Well, thanks, Preston. I've been looking forward to this. I'm honored that you asked me to do it. I've followed your work, over the years, and have been grateful. I've pointed several people to your book, People to Be Loved, and so it's cool for me to be having this conversation with you, and I'm excited.
That means a ton, man. Seriously, coming from you. Why don't we do this? Why don't you start by sharing your story? And maybe, for the small handful of people listening or watching that might not be familiar with your story, give us the 5-minute version of who is Wesley Hill and how has faith and sexuality been part of your journey?
Yeah. Well, thanks again. Thanks for having me. I guess I could start maybe with my childhood. I often tell people that my earliest memories as a child are of hearing my parents read Bible stories to me. We had a collection of books. They're called the Arch Books. Many of them are still in print, published by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, actually. They're short little books, and each one tells a Bible story. They're kind of beautifully illustrated, and so we just had stacks and stacks of these in our living room. And so from a very young age, my imagination was kind of formed by the stories of the Bible, and particularly the story of Jesus. I mean, I don't remember a time in my life when I wasn't kind of magnetically drawn to that story. I mean, it's a obviously there's no way to describe it that doesn't sound like a cliche, but it's just a absolutely mysteriously unsettling and profoundly
Mm.
compelling story. This figure who is rejected by his own people,
Mhm.
and rather than turning away from them or trying to blow them away, he instead gives his life for them
Mhm.
and for the whole world, and is raised from the dead 3 days later, and is now the Lord of the world.
Mhm.
And from my earliest days as a kid, I knew that somehow this story is the center of everything, and I could
Mhm.
see that my parents were trying to make it that way in their lives, and I wanted to do the same thing. And
Mhm.
I got older, and was very involved in our church youth group and kind of immersed in the life of the church. And as I was going through puberty, that was when it became clear to me that I was not straight. I remember talking to a lot of my other friends who were describing the ways they were becoming attracted to girls, and I did not have that experience. That was not what was happening with me. I was experiencing an awakening of my attractions, but they were for my guy friends rather than for
Mhm.
girls. And at that time, this was the late 90s, and it was a very different culture. And I didn't immediately, as strange as maybe it sounds now, I didn't immediately jump to the category of gay or homosexuality. I kind of wondered, am I going through a phase that other people are going through? Maybe this is just how it is for everybody. Maybe I'll grow out of it. Maybe something will, shift when I go away to college, and maybe I'll meet a woman that I want to marry. Um, but none of that happened. I kind of wrestled with this in secret, and realized that uh, I'll make a long story short, but it kind of became clear to me through a lot of prayer and counseling and talking with other friends eventually when I got to college, that this probably wasn't going away. This was probably going to
Mhm.
be my reality, this exclusive same-sex attraction. And so um, for me, it was never an option to just discard my Christian faith. I was too enamored with Jesus, and so it became a question for me of what does it look like to be gay and to
Mhm.
be a follower of Jesus? Can I do both of those things? And the book you mentioned, thanks for mentioning Watched and Waiting, Preston.
Mhm.
That book was published. The first edition was published in 2010,
Yeah.
and it was really me writing the book that I wanted to read, but that I couldn't find anywhere.
Huh.
I had found a lot of books that kind of promised some form of deliverance from same-sex attraction. If you follow this formula, or you pray this kind of prayer, or you experience this kind of therapy, you can experience a diminishing of your same-sex attraction and an awakening of heterosexual attraction. So there were lots of things I read in that vein. And then there were also lots of things I read that basically said, Christianity is oppressive, or at least traditional versions of Christianity are oppressive, and you should be looking for a same-sex partner. This
Mhm.
is the way to
Mhm.
live a full, flourishing life. And I just found myself unconvinced by either of those kind of answers and those sets
Mhm.
of solutions, if you will. And so for me,
Yeah.
it became a question of what would it look like to live with an ongoing experience of same sex desire that doesn't seem to be diminishing. I'm not even convinced God promises or wants to deliver me from that. What does it look like to go on living with that reality while also not pursuing heterosexual marriage, not pursuing same sex marriage, but
Mhm.
seeking to live a life of singleness and sort of self discipline, sexual abstinence?
Yeah.
Um, so that's the short version. So I ended up writing this book, Watched and Waiting, and it kind of launched me into the work that I'm doing tonight. Where I'm having
Yeah.
conversations with other believers about this, and just trying to help us all think more compassionately, more with more nuance, with
Mhm.
more kind of faithfulness to Christ and the witness of the Bible.
Mhm.
So that's what I want to do with you.
Yeah.
I just want to dive in once more into this conversation. So
I
thanks.
appreciate that. No, and I can only imagine how many times you've shared your story, and so here you are, many years later, still sharing it with the same zeal and passion that I can imagine you first um, had when you first shared it. What would you say are some, I'll just say, like, misunderstandings about celibacy? I mean, in 2020 or even 2010 when you wrote the book, I mean, that's pretty countercultural, even inside the church.
Yeah.
Like, is it just a miserable existence? Is it amazing? Do you have a lot more free time, or what? Like what? What are some of the maybe assumptions that Christians typically have about celibacy that you've maybe experienced a different, something different than maybe somebody's
Yeah,
assumptions?
yeah. Maybe I'll focus on one that I
Mhm.
hear sometimes, and that is that there's a certain class of human beings who are somehow just hardwired for this. Wes, you must be celibate because you're one of those people who's just good at this. You know
Yeah,
how to do it. And
you like
I
being
think
alone. You do, yeah.
exactly. And in fact, I'm trying to remember the book. I read a book by a Christian that I really respect. Maybe it's best that I can't remember who it was who said it. There was a line in the book that said, if you're one of these people and you're going on a beautiful hike, and you come to this amazing vista and you can see this incredible view, and you don't feel any kind of inner compulsion to have somebody standing next to you to talk about it with, then maybe you're called to celibacy. That was literally what it said. And I
Wow,
thought,
yeah.
I've never had that. I've always wanted someone there by my side to talk to about the view. I don't feel that I'm especially good at being alone or living without sex. So I think there's a little bit of a misconception that God would only ask people to be celibate if they're already somehow naturally wired for it, or
Huh.
if they somehow just enjoy, being by themselves. I mean, I would say I want to be careful here how I say this, but I think that if I were not convinced by Jesus, if I didn't have trust in Jesus, and if I didn't think the Bible was God's word to us, I'm pretty sure I would not want to be celibate.
Okay.
I don't think that it's somehow something I'm kind of naturally gifted for or
Yeah.
inclined towards. I'm doing it because I think it's what God wants me to do, and it's the path of faithfulness. So yeah, so I think I'd want to move us away from the idea, and I know there's debates about what Paul means, for example, when
Yeah.
he talks about celibacy in 1 Corinthians 7, but I'd want to move away from the idea that there's this special gifting that
Hmm.
somehow if you're one of the gifted ones, then your experience of celibacy is always just going to be this emotionally satisfying,
Mm.
kind of serene and confident experience. And
Yeah.
celibacy is not like that. It's much more challenging. There's a lot of there are joys, and we can talk about some of those, but there's also just ongoing questions. There's ongoing tension. There's the
Yeah.
experience of trying to live out my faith in a church that seems, kind of uh, obsessed with marriage and family life and
Hmm.
children, and kind of the whole ideal of the nuclear family as being the essential thing. Um, so yeah, I find it difficult. I don't find it easy. I find it rewarding. I find
Mm.
it joyful at times. I find it challenging at times, but it's not something that I think God only calls a certain class of people into.
Right. No, that's super helpful. And yeah, I think that resonates with how I understand Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 7. I think some people read that passage with the assumptions that you addressed, that if
Yeah,
you just love to be alone, then that means you must be called, you have the gift, the calling. And
right.
but I don't think the idea of gift or calling in scripture as a whole means you just emotionally resonate with what you're being called to.
Exactly. Exactly.
Ezekiel was called to be a prophet, and he was sort of dragged kicking and screaming. And a lot of
Yeah.
prophets, had a lot of hardship in their calling.
That's right. And I think we could say the same thing, right, about marriage. I mean, marriage and celibacy are parallel things in the Bible. They're both callings, and they're
Right.
both um, kind of forms of life that require sacrifice, that require
Yes.
challenge. And I think of the line that Stanley Hauerwas always says. He calls it Hauerwas's law. He says you always marry the wrong person. And what he means by that is if you think that marriage is just going to be this, like if you
Yeah.
find the one, the right one, then it's going to be bliss from there on out.
Yeah.
Because that's just
Yeah.
not how it works. And I would say the same thing about celibacy. If
Huh.
if you somehow get this idea that, ooh, I'm one of the people who's gifted for this, I'm one of the
Yeah.
specially called ones, this is going to be a breeze. Well,
Yeah.
it's not usually like that in the Christian life.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Marriage has been a breeze for me. No, it's I think and I don't want to get off too far off track, but I think in the church, it seems like when it comes to marriage and sex, we basically have adopted a secular ethic of marriage and sex. Except we've added a footnote, wait until you get married to have sex. That's like our great contribution to the
Yeah,
societal vision for marriage and sex, rather than God is calling you into marriage for a specific purpose. It's not the default.
right.
It's not simply about romance and falling in love. I'm not saying those very modern Western cultural values are intrinsically bad. I'm just saying that
Sure.
those aren't fundamental to the institution of marriage according to the way God seems to have designed it in scripture. But no one
That's right.
taught me this. I've had to learn this through many years. I mean, why did I
Yeah.
get married? I fell in love, and that's what you're supposed to do. And love, it's like, but I didn't really think through like a kingdom perspective of entering into marriage for the sake of the kingdom.
Right.
But yeah, yeah. So I mean, you kind of touched on it, but what are some things? Well, let's start positively. What are some things the church has done well in coming around you in your journey? And then I'm going to ask the opposite. What has it done maybe unintentionally that's been somewhat difficult? Um,
Yeah. Well, whenever we talk about the church, we have to talk about specifics, right? We can't talk about
yeah.
just the church as an abstract thing. And I would say that there were a couple of specific churches that I was involved in, as I was coming out. And then as I was in my later 20s trying to figure out, okay, so if I am committed to celibacy, what does a healthy celibacy look like?
Okay.
And I think the church that I was involved in when I was first coming out, in God's providence, it was a church that um, it emphasized to a large extent a theology of suffering, that the Christian life is not just a bed of roses. It's not
Mhm.
something that we can expect, to always be happy in. But that, as the book of Acts puts it, through many tribulations we must
Mhm.
enter the kingdom of God. And I think
Yeah.
particularly for me in those years, my pastors who I was talking with them about my sexuality. They directed me in particular to Paul's writings, and a passage like Second Corinthians chapter 4, where
Yeah.
Paul describes the Christian life as a growing conformity to the dying of Jesus.
Right.
In other
Wow.
words, we are called as Christians not just to enjoy the triumph of the resurrection, but to actually walk with Jesus into suffering. And
Hmm.
that this is not abnormal, this is a normal part of the Christian life. And Paul in Romans 8 actually kind of universalizes it. He says, in fact, the whole
Mhm.
creation is groaning.
Mhm.
We're all bearing the burden of our mortality and our fallenness and our brokenness, and we are straining forward to the day to await the resurrection of the body, which is actually where my book title "Watched and Waiting" comes from.
Hmm.
Paul describes the life of the Christian in Romans 8 as a life of waiting,
Right.
and it's not just a kind of twiddle your thumbs waiting. It's a groaning waiting. It's like a woman in childbirth. There's pain. You're longing for this baby to just be
Yeah.
born already. And the time is not there. And so I think that was
Huh.
super helpful to me because I was already at that point realizing this is hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard being gay. It's not what I would have chosen for my life. I wrestled desperately with loneliness, when I was in
Mhm.
my early 20s. And
Hmm.
so to have this church come alongside me and say, Wes, we want to walk through you with this, but we also want you to be able to see that the pain that you're feeling is something that unites you with every other believer. If believers are honest, right?
Right.
Because if we're all honest, we've all got elements in our lives that speak to us profoundly of the fallenness and the brokenness of the world.
Right.
And
Right.
and I think our calling is to, as our Roman Catholic friends would say, to unite our sufferings with the sufferings of
Yeah.
Christ.
I
Um,
want to read a line. I was just reading this right before we popped on. This is from page 119. It's exactly what you're saying. I even have it.
oh,
Oh,
thanks.
by the way, just this is kind of. I have a friend of mine who is. He's been a Christian pastor for several decades, theologically, politically conservative,
Yeah.
and he's been closeted his whole life. Holds to a traditional sexual. I think married to a woman, has
Yeah.
kids, grandkids, and he gave me his copy of Watch and
Uh,
Waiting so that
uh,
I could read his highlights and notes. So
wow. Wow.
he
That's
has
great.
this. I noticed this little box he wrote here, but you say page 119. I've come to realize my need to take the New Testament witness seriously. That groaning and grief and feeling broken are legitimate ways for me to express my cross-bearing discipleship to Jesus. It's not as if groaning means I am somehow doing something wrong. Groaning is a sign of my fidelity. That's just,
Mm.
I mean, and here's what I just, this is should be such a common human experience. It's unfortunate that straight married people kind of don't maybe get this enough, or we maybe hide our groanings, whereas yours is very much just part of your day-to-day journey. Is very much out there.
Mm.
But I think we all need to hear that. Is it ever? I get this mainly from, I would say, more progressive minded friends.
Yeah.
Is it ever hard when straight married Christians, or I guess even non-Christians, say, well, Wes, you just need to, this is the cross you have to bear? And it's almost like, do you ever feel like it's a little bit
Yeah.
like, well, it must be nice for you to tell me that, because I get that a lot in, again, more broader circles,
Sure.
which is why I typically just quote my friends like you and say, this is their story.
Yeah.
These are their words, not mine. But
Yeah.
is that ever hard for?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think everything depends on how we, in the church talk about this. If it becomes an us versus them thing, like
Mhm.
you gay folks are called to an especially burdensome discipleship. Your cross is heavier. I mean, not only does that kind of weirdly put gay people up on pedestals as though they're like these gay saints or something, but it also distances just other Christians who wrestle with other things from this profound theology of groaning, which I think is, it's not just the preserve of gay folks. It's all of us who are in
Yeah,
Christ are called to join this Calvary discipleship. Take up our
yeah,
cross and follow Jesus. He doesn't just say that to people who are making sexual sacrifices.
hmm, yeah,
In fact, I would say the majority of the sacrifices Jesus calls for in the Gospels have to do with money, not to do with sex. So yeah, so
right,
I think as soon as we start, yeah, I mean, I actually find it profoundly helpful when people talk about my discipleship as carrying a cross, as long as they're not saying that's my special thing. This is something that
right,
unites us. This is something that
right.
we share in Christ.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. What do you say? You know, you're a celibate Christian. I'm gonna say celibate Christian who is gay. We'll come back to the gay Christian thing in just
Sure,
1 second.
sure.
What do you say to people that look at you almost out of pity and say, "Oh, poor Wes. He's just so brainwashed by this conservative, religious, right kind of evangelical perspective, and you've got all this internalized shame. And so you have kind of convinced yourself of this traditional sexual ethic, but it's really the fault of people like me. I mean, I get this accusation quite a bit that people like me, straight Christian leaders, are in a sense brainwashing people like you. I mean, in a sense, you brainwashed me before because you've been in this conversation a lot longer than I have. But I'm sure you get that a lot. How do you respond to that? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I guess I, zooming out to the widest angle lens, I think we can recognize we're in a very pluralist society, and increasingly, even within the church, we are divided over this issue. So I think any notion that someone like me could just walk into a church or a public space and have my view and my lifestyle, my life choices automatically understood and affirmed is probably just kind of a fairy tale at this point. Like that's just not the world that we live in. Even as Christians, I'm in a denomination where there's actually disagreement over this issue, and so
mhm,
even within my own church, there are voices that would say that I'm, like you say, that I'm kind of
right.
brainwashed, that I'm self-hating, that I
Yeah.
have internalized homophobia, and I think honestly, I think part of my responsibility is to listen to that, and to, not assume that just because I'm following or I'm trying to follow Jesus, that I don't have anything to learn from my critics,
Mhm.
and
Hmm.
I think there are people who say the kind of things you just mentioned in a very dismissive way. They don't
Yeah.
want to have a conversation with me. They just want to dismiss my
Mhm.
my perspective, and that's fine. I mean, we can't really do anything there. But there
Yeah.
are progressive Christians who I think genuinely recognize that my life is an attempt to follow the same Jesus that they believe in. And those are the people that I feel like we can at least begin to have a conversation. I think of someone like the scholar Eugene Rogers,
Yeah.
who's written a book called Sexuality in the Christian Body. It's not finally convincing to me. It's a kind of, I hate to call it progressive because it's actually not very progressive. It's kind of conservative, but it's a conservative case for same-sex
Huh.
marriage and
Okay.
same-sex sexual intimacy. But I don't think it ultimately convinces. But when I read that book, I couldn't deny this is someone arguing from the deepest
Hmm.
sources of the Christian faith. He's going back to scripture, he's going back to the great thinkers of Christian theology like St. Thomas Aquinas and Karl Barth. He's trying to make a deeply Christian argument. And I think our calling in this very fraught moment that we're in right now in the year 2020 is to try to put the best possible construction on our opponent's views and on their motives,
Yeah.
if we ever hope to have a genuine conversation.
Yeah.
Um, I do, yeah, I do feel frustrated when there's those dismissive kind of, oh, Wes, you're just self-hating, uh, but I think there are people who make who worry about my
Yeah.
stance with better arguments and kind of
Yeah.
better perspectives that I do want to take seriously.
It does seem a little disingenuous, if not dehumanizing, when somebody doesn't even know you. Like, to assume that they know what's going on in your inner psyche
Yeah,
without even knowing you, having a conversation like that. That just seems not only arrogant, but just not really like a genuine.
yeah.
But yeah, like not everybody that makes that argument would say that. But I
Right,
hear
and
it a lot.
and to give the benefit of the doubt to people who talk that way, there's a whole kind of rhetorical line out there that says that celibacy is the new ex-gay paradigm, and I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's true, but I think underneath that is something I can affirm, which is that the
Okay.
whole ex-gay way of trying to pastor and care for people like me was flawed. It was
Okay.
misguided. It overpromised change that it couldn't
Mhm.
deliver on. So I understand why there are people who are upset. And I just hope with my life to be able to show,
Yeah.
embracing a life of celibacy for the sake of the gospel is not the same thing as trying to, engineer some psychic fix for myself, or put myself through
Yeah.
psychological torture and try to become straight. That's not what's happening here.
Okay. Yeah. All right. One more question before we turn it over to the audience. Gay Christian. This has been a hot button phrase in the last couple, 2, 3 years, especially. And there's some really smart, good, godly people on both sides of this. Some people say the very term gay, just from you know what I'm talking about, but for the audience, some people would say that if you believe in a traditional sexual ethic, you should never use the term gay as a self-description. That term is so loaded in culture, and it comes with all this baggage, and especially the phrase gay Christian. Those two terms should never be side by side, and the analogies are often given. I don't call myself an adulterous Christian. I don't call myself an idolatrous Christian. I don't call myself a lustful Christian. Why would anybody call themselves a gay Christian? You've written on this extensively, and I know it can become weary, kind of saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over, and you still feel like people aren't at least listening to what you're actually saying. So you've got a few minutes, Wes. Explain to us your understanding of that phrase and maybe respond to some of the concerns people might have with it.
Yeah. Well, it may be that I'm responsible for a lot of the consternation over that phrase because, as you mentioned, I did write a book with that phrase in the subtitle. So my book, Spiritual Friendship, the subtitle is "Finding Love in the
Yeah.
Church as a Celibate Gay Christian."
Yeah.
And I will say it's very important to me that the main word in that phrase is not celibate nor gay. It's Christian. Christian is the noun. And Christian goes back to the book of Acts. It basically means little Christ. Those of us who follow Jesus are meant to be little Christs. We're meant to take on the character and the life of Jesus and live that out in the world. So that's the fundamental thing to me. That's more important than how I identify my sexual orientation or my nationality or my racial identity. I think Christian trumps everything else. So that'd be the first point I'd want to make. Um, The other thing I would say is people have kind of fixated, as you've said, on this phrase gay Christian, as though
Hmm.
this is the kind of special category of Christians. And I don't think of it that way. I can't remember a time when I've ever just kind of gone up to someone and introduced myself. Hi, I'm Wes. I'm a gay Christian. It doesn't
Yeah.
it's not an identifier for me in that way. Um, so I use it primarily just as a shorthand. I personally find the phrase Christian who experiences same-sex attraction to be just incredibly cumbersome and kind of a mouthful. Like I don't want to have
Yeah.
to write
Yeah.
that or say that every time I'm talking about this. I also think gay is just kind of it's the immediately recognizable word for someone who experiences same-sex desire
Hmm.
in our world. That may be changing. I mean, my friend Eve Tushnet says there's probably nobody going to be identifying as gay in 50 years. These things are always in cultural flux. So
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't want to load the word gay with some kind of like heavy ontological content or something. I think it's a
Okay.
kind of shorthand phrase. For me, it's a way of trying to be honest about the fact that um, you know, yes, the people you see as gay out in the culture, the way they talk about their longings, that they have romantic and deeply affectionate and yes, also sexual attractions and feelings for people of their own sex. That's what I mean by gay. And I experienced that too. And I'm a Christian, and my faith in Christ, for whatever reason, has not meant the removal of that. I've
Hmm.
prayed for it to be removed. I've asked God to take it away, like Paul asked for his thorn in the flesh to be
Yeah.
taken away. And for whatever reason, God has not.
Hmm.
So for me, being gay is a way of trying to be honest. It would be like I remember talking with a friend of mine once, and I realize analogies are tricky
Hmm.
in this whole area. So please don't take what I'm about to say in a really absolute sense. It's just an analogy. But I remember talking to a friend of mine who has a Down syndrome daughter, a daughter with Down syndrome, and she said, it's to somehow try to say that my daughter's selfhood, her core kind of identity as a person is what matters, and I don't have to think of her under the category of Down syndrome. My friend said that just doesn't feel honest to me. That
Hmm.
doesn't feel like I'm in touch with the reality of my daughter's existence.
Yeah.
Insofar as she lives in this fallen world, this is her reality, and so she does have Down syndrome, and yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. Now,
Hmm.
it's also important to me to immediately then say I'm celibate. I'm not only gay, but I'm also celibate, and that's very important because how I am seeking to live out my life with same-sex attraction is to turn away from, to say no to
Hmm.
those inclinations to have sexual intimacy with someone of the same sex because I think that that's sinful. And
Hmm.
so I'm embracing a life of sexual abstinence, um, seeking to live that faithfully as a way of following Jesus. It really is all about the relationship with Jesus for me.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm gonna go on using the word gay. I don't see any good reason to stop using it. But I recognize it's challenging, and maybe
Yeah.
some listeners tonight will want to ask follow-up questions there. But that's kind of the
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and if you guys want to learn more about that, the blog you're a part of, Spiritual Friendship.
yeah, we've
Have you been blogging recently at all, or I haven't read it in a while?
we've kind of a lot of us who were contributing have kind of gone on to other things. It's still all
Okay,
there, kind of
okay,
archived.
good.
It's not really being updated at the moment.
I mean, you've written so many articles on this and I think your most recent. What's the one about weariness or whatever? That one's got
I
lots
think
of
it's
links to.
called weariness. Yeah,
It's just called.
I think it's just called weariness. Yeah,
If you just Google Wesley Hill weariness, you might get
that's
this
right.
blog. But in that blog, you've got lots of links to other articles.
That's
And
right.
if people would just spend some time there, I'm not even say they have to agree.
Right.
But when
Right.
I hear the criticisms of everything you kind of explained, it just doesn't seem like the majority of the criticisms are actually listening to what you mean by the phrase and what you're saying. And if they do and then they still disagree, I'm fine with that. I think the church needs to be a place where we can come into the table and not
Yeah.
call each other heretics, but have a conversation and agree to disagree. But I just still think there's a lot of yeah. Anyway, I don't want to get too far down the weeds, but yeah, I encourage people to read that.
Yeah.
Let's go. We're going to move to your Q and A from the audience. before I do, a couple of quick announcements. We have another webinar in a couple weeks called A Christian Perspective on Parenting Trans Kids slash Teens. And I've got two amazing guests for that webinar, Bill Henson and Leslie Hudson Reynolds. Bill has worked with literally thousands of Christian families with LGBTQ kids, and just he's, to me, the expert in this area. And then Leslie has experienced lifelong gender dysphoria. So we're going to have an hour and a half long conversation. So if you're a parent, youth worker, or anybody really interested in the trans conversation, how to be a mentor to trans kids, I would highly recommend that webinar. You can go to the same webinar info where you got a hold of this one. Also, were you going to get a follow-up email after this webinar? And in that, there's going to be a little statement saying, hey, if you'd like to support the center, here's the link to do so. And in the day and age of COVID, our ministry definitely needs support. So if you have extra means, you feel called to support us, if you have found the ministry we're doing helpful, then we would encourage you to at least pray about supporting the center. And also, lastly, one more time, go buy Wes's books. Wes is he's taking up his evening, or at least an hour of it, to come on here. We're not paying him. We're not in charge for this. So if you have not read both of these books, you got to go buy them. Okay, buy a couple copies and give them out to friends. They're absolutely incredible, and they're not very long either. I mean, this book is really short. I mean, you could read this in, I think I read it in half a day. I'm a slow reader, but anyway, let's go to the Q&A now, and I will just field these, Wes, and let's see. I need to go to presenter mode. Present in full screen. Here we go. All right. Okay, this is from Mitchell Springfield. And you can be anonymous. You can give your name. How would you encourage the local church or ministry to uphold friendship and community at the same level of marriage? We touched on that, where in the church, marriage seems to be idolized, might be too strong, but in some contexts, I don't think it is too strong. How would you encourage the local church to do this? This is a great question.
Yeah. Well, I had started to say earlier that in the evening when you were asking about what the church had done right, how the church had blessed me. One of the experiences in church I had, I moved to the UK for graduate school to study New Testament at Durham, which was one of the great experiences of my life, training there for in theological education. But I found myself going to this small, very vibrant and warmly alive, charismatic evangelical church, right in the heart of the city center of Durham. And one of the things that I think made that church so inviting for me is not only that there were a lot of single people, but that there were single leaders in the church. So I think probably a lot of us know of churches that have good singles groups, singles cell groups, small groups, Bible study groups, singles ministries, but it's much more rare, I think, at least in the evangelical world, to find churches that are actually elevating single people to places of influence and places of ministry prominence, where they can be visible.
Right.
And if you pay attention to the conversation around racial justice in the church, one of the things that people will say is, if you want your church to be a place of genuine racial dialogue and diversity, it has to start from the level of visible leadership. It's not enough for majority white churches to say, hey, we want more Black and brown Christians worshiping with us, but we don't want to give up any of our positions of power. We don't want to actually let them lead anything. And I think I would say something similar, that if you want your church to be recognized as a place that is a place that values and honors the life of singleness, I would encourage you to look for ways to make single people influential. There's a line in Lauren Winter's book Real Sex, which she wrote years ago, but I still love this. She said she made it a point when she was single at the time to be a thorn in her pastor's side, that if there was any committee that was formed, if there was any kind of influential movement that was happening in the church, single people needed to be on those committees. Single people needed to have their voices heard. And so, yeah, I think I would encourage you in that way to look for ways to elevate single people. Don't just view us as people who are needy. We are needy. All of us are needy,
We're
right?
all needy. Yeah.
We do love to be invited over, to your homes for dinner and things like this. But also view us as people who are gifted by the Holy Spirit, just like you are. And we
Okay.
have gifts and callings that we need to bring to the church and to serve right alongside you. So, I mean, one of the striking things about Paul in the New Testament is that he's always talking about spiritual gifts as a mutual thing. God gives you gifts so that you can build up the body, and God gives other members of the body gifts so that they can build up you. And there's always this mutual movement. It's never just a one-way street where
Yeah.
the married folks are the ones who are the benefactors and the single
Yeah.
folks are the beneficiaries.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Good.
I think that's what I'd say.
Good word. I would echo everything you said. Wes, do you feel, quote, proud of your sexuality and how it uniquely equips you to contribute to God's kingdom? And what do you think of pride as a cultural phenomenon? This is a great question.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I don't know that I've never thought of it in those terms that I feel proud of my sexuality. I think I have. I mean, when I was initially coming out, I wanted desperately to be straight.
Mhm.
I had grown up in a very traditional conservative family, and from the time I was a young boy, I had played house, with my sister. I just imagined I'd be a husband and a dad one day.
Mhm.
And so when it looked like that dream was imperiled, I was nervous. I wanted to try to still live that life. So initially, I felt only shame over my
Mhm.
sexuality. And I think as I've gone on in my Christian life, I've realized, God will often allow painful things into our lives precisely in order to shape us, to
Mhm.
form us into the Christians He wants us to be. And I think I can honestly say I'm not sure that I would be. I mean, this is obviously a kind of hypothetical, but I'm not sure I would be as desperate for the Lord, as sort of pressing into my faith as I am now, because I've had to live through
Mhm.
this experience of being gay. And let me just say, you know, I have not yet met a gay person for whom this has been easy.
Mhm.
I think conservative Christians sometimes think, well, the whole culture is now so LGBTQ affirming, like all of
Yeah.
the weight of cultural pressure is on your side. What could you have to be depressed about or worried about? It turns out that no, it's just pretty hard to be in the minority sexually,
Huh.
whether you're in church or whether you're in wider society. So I think that those of us who are in that position have had to see the ways that this experience actually carries gifts for us as well as
Mhm.
challenges. Um,
That's a good
one of
word.
the letters that I've leaned on a lot over the years was written by C.S. Lewis to a friend of his talking about homosexuality. And he says, the way he wants to approach this issue is through the story of the man born blind in John chapter 9. And he says, if you look at that story carefully, it's not just that the blindness is this, entirely irredeemable negative thing. It's that the blindness becomes the very occasion for Jesus to show his glory and his
Yeah.
power as he heals that blindness. And
Mhm.
so Lewis goes on to say, what is it about having a same-sex sexual orientation that might become the occasion for God to
Mhm.
shape you and display God's glory in ways that wouldn't have been possible
Mhm.
otherwise? So if you want to call that proud of my sexuality, fine.
Yeah.
I don't know that that would be quite my designation for it, but
I don't know if
certainly,
that's the right word. Like, I wouldn't be proud of my blindness, and yet I could turn right around and see it as a major conduit for God's power and
and I could
grace.
even give thanks for it in that way,
Yeah. Yeah.
in a certain sense. Now, let me
Yeah.
just say something quickly about pride, and I'm just going to direct you to
Yeah.
a place on the internet. There is a wonderful um, essay that I try to reread every June, Pride
Hmm.
Month, right? And it's by Eve Tushnet. Eve is a friend of mine. She's a Roman Catholic lesbian woman who is also celibate. She's written a brilliant book called Gay and Catholic, which I would recommend to everyone on the
Mhm.
webinar tonight. It's just chock
Yep.
full of wisdom. She's got a sequel to that coming out, which I'm very much looking forward to. But she wrote an essay a few years ago called Romo Eroticism. Homoeroticism. And
Only Eve can come up with
I
a title
know,
like
right?
that.
I know. So the Romo is that comes from Roman Catholic Church. She's Roman Catholic, but she talks about pride, and she says, what if the church didn't only view itself as being called to condemn the kind of
Mhm.
excessive kind of sexual profligacy, of pride. It's a kind of
Mhm.
um, the moral laxity of it is something that Christians often want to condemn.
Mhm.
What if we didn't view that though as our only response? What if we actually looked for what are the deep longings that are fueling the pride movement,
Mhm.
and how can the gospel speak into those? How does
Mhm.
Jesus speak into the powerful fears and hopes and dreams that go into pride?
Yeah.
So I'll just direct you to Romo eroticism and encourage you
Romo eroticism by Eve
by
Tushnet.
touching it. Yep.
All right, next question. Are celibate partnerships slash covenant friendships a valid calling for celibate gay Christians? If so, what are your primary concerns about such relationships? We are pulling out all the really good questions here. Wes, what are your thoughts? I don't know if I've heard you talk on this.
Yeah. So the short answer is yes, they are a valid calling, I think. The longer answer would be I think this is a matter that shouldn't just be determined by individuals. I think the way I read the New Testament, we are all as believers deeply implicated in each other's lives. And this whole secular idea that what I do in the bedroom is my own business and nobody else has anything to say to me about that, that's
Yeah.
not a very Christian way of thinking. The Bible says we are members of one another. And therefore, what you do in your life affects me, and what I do in my life affects you because we're bound together in the same body. So the partnerships, the celibate partnerships that I have the most respect for, that I have seen work well, are when two people say, we think that we are being called to love each other and care for each other in a way that goes above and beyond just a kind of normal friendship. We think we're being called to like make commitments to each other. And we recognize that we're going to need boundaries. We're going to need support and encouragement and accountability. And so they go to their pastor or their priest, and they invite the Christian community to
Hmm.
speak into their lives. Let me just say quickly, I think one of the worries that people have about this kind of thing is that it's just opening the door to
Yeah.
sexual temptation. I've heard people say if I was an alcoholic, it would be foolish to rent an
Yeah.
apartment above a liquor store. I'm just playing with fire. And I get that. I get that, of course. I mean, sexual sin, I think, is a danger, and we're warned away from it in Scripture. I mean, think about the story of Joseph. He literally like runs away from Potiphar's wife. We're
Yeah.
supposed to run far away from sexual sin. But I guess I think that we also have to reckon with the fact that it's not only sexual sin that's a danger to gay Christians.
Hmm.
It's also loneliness, isolation, feeling that I can't make commitments to anybody. I can't make promises to anybody because my sexuality is so damaged that I'm not worthy of entering into that kind of thing. So I just think if we only focus on the potential sexual temptation, we may miss other kinds of temptation
Huh.
and pressure that would come if someone didn't pursue something like this. Um, I don't think these kind of partnerships are for everybody. I don't live in one myself. I do have a very public commitment to another family that I share a house with.
Yeah.
It's a straight married couple and their two children who are my godchildren. So
Uh,
that's kind of the way I live out a committed,
huh.
vowed friendship. But I certainly wouldn't want to rule out, just point blank, the idea
Yeah.
that there might be two same-sex attracted people who would be called to make a particularly binding commitment to each other and to refrain from sexual intimacy. And
Yeah.
actually, maybe I'll just say one more thing quickly on this. I think that if we think pastorally, if we think missionally, we have to grapple with the fact that there may be couples who, before they met Christ or before they became convinced of a traditional view of marriage, they've already married each other. They've maybe
Mhm.
adopted children. They're already in relationship to each other. And then if they come to embrace what I think the Bible teaches on this, if our only answer to them is you guys have to divorce and exit one another's lives and not think of yourselves as bound together or committed to each other in any way, that seems to me to be really problematic. And it seems to me to be an overly harsh pastoral
Mhm.
approach. I personally would rather, if I were pastoring a couple in that scenario, I would want to say, look, I think that it's very likely that God drew you two together. He wants you in each other's lives. He doesn't want you to think of your relationship as a sexual one anymore. He doesn't want you to put it under the category of marriage. He wants you to think of it as a devoted friendship.
Mm.
And of course that's going to be hard. Of course that's going to be challenging. But if we rule out from the beginning and say that can never happen, it seems to me that we're leaving ourselves in a
Mm.
pretty pastorally um, heavy-handed place that I
Yeah,
don't think I want to end up in.
that's good. That's yeah, so much to chew on there. All right, next question. This comes from a buddy of mine, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us tonight. You would love this. I don't. You've never met Jonathan Burden, have you?
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
All the way from. Well, I'm not going to describe more about you, but thanks for this question, Wesley. Can you talk about? He has a similar story as you. Can you
Hmm.
talk about how being gay has impacted your close friendships? What are the dangers you've seen, and what are the blessings?
Yeah. Yeah, this is so tricky to talk about, and I've circled around this over the years in my writing, and people have criticized what I've said on it. So I want to try to be really careful about how I answer this. But I I think I'm like most gay people in this. I the desire to have sex is one piece of the experience of being gay for me, but it's certainly not the entire thing.
Mhm.
I think that there are forms of male intimacy that are not genital, that are not
Mhm.
sexual
Mhm.
in that narrow sense, that seem to be heightened in me.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that straight men don't have deeply personal, male friendships. They do. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm in a circle of friends. We go away for a week together every summer. I'm the only gay one out of the five of us. They're all married to women. And that I mean, one of the joys for me of this group is they love me, but they also love each other deeply.
Uh,
So I think that I want to be careful here to say, this longing for male closeness that I have, it's not unique to gay people, but it seems to be a kind of, um, I think here's the way I want to put it. It's not that being gay, the kind of givenness of that experience automatically makes you a better friend. But I think what it's done in my life at least is it's caused me to think long and hard, and I think with much more intentionality than I ever would have done
mm,
otherwise, about how I can cultivate appropriate, godly, close
mhm.
male intimacy. Because I have this deep longing to know men, to be loved by men, to love men, and I have to think, what does it look like for that desire to be purified and to be sanctified and to be kind of
Mhm.
elevated and made richer by the gospel.
Yeah.
So just because of that, I've had to seek it out more. I've had to think about it more. I've had to wrestle with it more in prayer. So I
Mhm.
think that my experience of being gay, which I believe God in His providence allowed into my life, has become the channel by which I've learned how to better pursue male closeness.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
not always been easy. I mean, I've made a lot of mistakes. I mean, I've been very clingy with friends. I've been very needy with
Mhm.
friends. I've had to learn a lot about codependency.
Mm.
And I have a spiritual director that I talk a lot. I talk with him a lot about the problems that come up for me in male friendship, problems of lust, problems
Yeah.
of wanting more intimacy than my friend can actually give, problems of jealousy.
Mm.
All these things are very much on the surface for me, and I'm working through them.
Mhm.
But so I think being gay is just, to make a
Mhm.
long story short, it's forced me to be a lot more intentional and a lot more thoughtful about my male friendships than I probably would have been.
Yeah. Wes, I really appreciate your honesty. That's I appreciate that. It's super helpful. And yeah, yeah, well, for the sake of time, I'll just jump in. I've got a lot of everything you're saying in my mind just going, man. I wish they could be 3 hour long webinar. But is there anything that we celebrate? Is there anything that we celebrate single heterosexuals can be doing in the church to pave the way for acceptance of celibate homosexual singles?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's worded. Do you understand the
I think
question?
so. So
Okay.
it's how
Yeah.
can straight single people help make the church better for gay single
I think
people?
so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for that question. I have a friend who uses the phrase, "We're all in solidarity with each other in the church in our different ways of pursuing chastity." And
Huh.
I think if we think of all of us, whether we're straight or married, sorry, whether we're straight or gay or married or single, all of us are called to pursue the virtue of chastity, sexual purity,
Mhm.
sexual holiness. So I just think if those of you who are straight and single can view us as your partners, your allies in that quest, and we can look up to you in the same
Mhm.
way. I mean, I know for me, just anecdotally, when I read about faithful single lives, I think of someone like John Stott, who was
Mhm.
a great Anglican evangelical preacher for many years in the 20th century. He was
Mhm.
probably a straight man. All the indications are that he was straight, but he never married.
Mhm.
And just to read his biography as I've done is to feel
Mhm.
inspired. I feel like here's someone else who has kind of walked the single life and has shown that it can be a rich and fruitful and relationally deep life. I mean, he had a lot of children all over the world who grew up knowing him as Uncle John. And I can look and say, man, that celibate heterosexual single life is a paradigm for me. It's an
Mhm.
inspiration to me in so many ways. I mean, I have a lot of kids who call me Uncle Wes too, and
Uh-huh.
I look up to John Stott as someone who kind of blazed the trail in that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, just existing, you being yourself as a celibate heterosexual person in the church is a gift to me and an encouragement
Yeah.
to me.
That's great. Awesome. All right, maybe a couple more here. Let's see. Wes, the church unfairly places you on a pedestal and points to you as a doable model for celibacy. What's been the hard and difficult moments for you? Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think Preston and I were talking about this a little bit before the webinar started tonight. I think it's very difficult to be a public figure talking about homosexuality right now.
Hmm.
Our culture is so terribly polarized on this issue. And as I said earlier, the church is terribly polarized on this issue. I often feel as though I'm kind of a soldier on the castle wall, sticking my head up and then getting arrows, lobbed at me from both sides. And um, I think you're right. There's a certain kind of loneliness that comes with being treated as a poster boy, as I have been sometimes. And I try, however I can, to disabuse people of that idea that I'm somehow the model. I think that there are so many different ways of living a celibate life. There are so many different personality types and
Hmm.
styles of even just kind of self-presentation, how you dress, how you are in the world. I mean, my one way of doing it is only one way of doing it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
one of the beautiful things about church history is just seeing the glorious diversity of the lives of the saints.
Hmm.
I mean, think about how different, a Saint Francis of Assisi looks from um, an Ignatius of Loyola or a Martin Luther or a Martin Luther King Jr. There's just such a uniqueness to each of the
Hmm.
saints.
Hmm.
And so I would want anyone who's listening tonight who feels like, if you are thinking about whether you can actually commit to trying to live out what Jesus is calling you to in your sexual life, and your worry is that you're somehow going to have to look like me. Can I just free you from that burden? You do not have to look like me. You do not have to do it the way I do it. You do not have to talk the way I talk or even use the same vocabulary that I
Hmm.
use. Eve, my friend Eve, who I've mentioned, she says, your unstinting devotion to Christ is so much more valuable to God than the way you talk about that or the way you
Hmm.
self-describe. So just aim at Jesus, focus on Jesus, and don't put me on a pedestal. Don't think that I'm the paradigm for how this has to look. Look to Him, and He'll show you how to live out His life in your own particular way.
Let me see if we can get one or maybe one or two more. Ben has a really good question here. How would you advise for or against a celibate gay Christian who desires to raise kids? Adoption as a single person, joining family friends and raising their kids?
Great question.
Yeah.
Um, Here's what I'll say. I don't think there's anything that would prevent you from adopting, but if you're going to adopt, make sure that you have a family-like community around you. As it happens, this week, actually, my housemates are out of town, and Melanie, the wife of Aiden in this couple I live with, her mother has come to the house this week to help me with the kids. So the
Uh-huh.
kids are ages 4 and 1, and I cannot imagine doing it by myself. It's just chaos, you know. So I love that I get to be involved in parenting along with two other biological parents. Um, if God is tugging at your heart to adopt, I would just say make sure you talk about that with your church and make it a church project. Make sure you've got people in your life who say if this is what you're called to, we're going to help you do it. But
Mhm.
don't try to do it alone. Don't try to just go it solo, because man, it's going to be tough.
Yeah. Wes, I've taken you 1 minute over. So anyway, yeah, there's so many good questions. I apologize, you guys. I mean, we can never get to them all. There's some really, really good questions here. I have a lot. Oh my gosh, yeah, these. So I really apologize for that. Please do join us in the next webinar in a couple weeks. It's going to be a bit longer. But Wes, thank you so much for your heart, your ministry, and I just one of the underlying reasons why I wanted to have you on is just your presence is so kind, and some people know you as an author over there, a blogger over there, but they never maybe have even heard you speak or seen you face to face through, through a screen. But your kindness is just really attractive, and I
Well,
wish more Christians were kind like you are. And yeah,
thanks, brother. I
yeah,
appreciate that very much, and thanks for having me on. It's an honor. And
yeah.
all of you who are wrestling with this, who are asking these good questions, thank you. It means so much to me as a sexual minority in the church that you
Mhm.
are so engaged and invested in this. And please pray for me, and I'll pray for you.
All right. God bless you guys. Have a good night.
Take care. Bye, everyone.